Oliver Burkeman, thank you so much for joining me today.
It's a pleasure. Thanks for inviting me.
Pleasure to have you. So I want to ask you about your book, 4,000 Weeks, Time Management for Mortals. What is this about, and why did you write it, and what's the main point of the book?
I guess that book, I'm sort of between books right now because I have another one coming out shortly. They're both sort of plow a related furrow, but that book, 4,000 Weeks, specifically emerged from really my own experience of being a kind of a slightly obsessive productivity geek person who was really into kind of ways of managing my time and beginning to realize that I was maybe never going to find the silver bullet approach, the one that made me feel like I was finally on top of everything and everything was running smoothly at last. So it's really a book about what happens when you really begin to take seriously what it means that we're finite, that there's always going to be more things that you could legitimately spend your time doing than you're going to get time for, that you're never going to be able to have the kind of control over how time unfolds that you might really wish to have. And I hope that the end result of this, obviously it sounds a little bit depressing when I put it like that, but I think that the end result is that it's the opposite of depressing. It's actually when you stop, when you give up a little bit on the fight to make yourself perfectly optimized and perfectly efficient and all the rest of it, that's actually when you're free to focus on a handful of things that really move the needle and make a difference in your life. So in the end, I think it is a bit of a productivity book, but it gets there by being, through my own disillusionment with productivity culture, I suppose.
So what's the conclusion then? Our life is limited. What do we do with that? Like, how do we have meaningful lives, or is that the goal? Is the goal?
Well, I'm not sure I think it's more, it's in a way, it's more the starting point than the conclusion, right? Our lives just are limited, right? All we're doing here is pointing to some things that are true about being human. Now, I think we're very tempted to try to sort of deny them to ourselves and to follow advice and life philosophies that sort of help us ignore these truths. But I think that they are where we start from. And yes, I think building a meaningful and an enjoyable and a sort of full of life is the best, as good a description as any of the goal here. And so what I'm sort of arguing is that doing that well and having and building a kind of meaningful life, it's best if that starts from the understanding of the facts about our finitude, instead of this tendency that I think there is in a lot of self-help and personal development literature to sort of run away from it and try to sort of keep alive this fantasy of doing everything or being absolutely perfect at things or feeling absolutely in control of things. If you start from this kind of slightly depressing reality that we do have to make tough choices, that we never know what the future holds, that we probably can't make ourselves, emotionally invulnerable and free of anxiety completely and free of uncertainty, it's actually really not depressing. It's actually the opposite. It's actually really empowering, because then you're like, okay, I'm breathing the cold air of reality. This is how it is. It has some downsides. It's a little uncomfortable, but on that basis now, I can say, okay, given that I'm not going to get everything done, what would actually be the most interesting and useful and enlivening things to do with my day? Given that I can't expect to answer 400 emails in a day and also spend 6 hours with my kid, because these are just incompatible uses of finite time. How do I want to make that trade-off in the way that means the most to me, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera?
So it's about just realizing that we have limited time. We're all dying. We all have limited time. And with that realization and acknowledgement, hopefully we are more we have more intention and are more conscientious about how we do spend that time.
Yeah,
is that part of the teaching? Like just to be intentional, because we know we're dying. We know we have limited time.
It is. But I think there's an important nuance there that's useful to talk about, right? Because there's one version of this that can turn into something really quite stressful that says like, okay, time is limited, so you've really got to try to pack every minute with extraordinary activities and go do like crazy action sports every weekend and build incredibly successful companies or become famous or something. And all of those things are good things to do, but the that sort of high pressure approach is not what I'm getting at. What I'm actually trying to say is there's something very empowering and productive and meaningful about this, but there's also something kind of relaxing about it. Because when you see just like how finite we are, it becomes clear that, you know, doing everything you can think of, or, you know, going every single place you might want to go, realizing every single ambition you might want to realize, it's just obviously not on the cards for human beings, right? So at that point, I feel anyway, when I contemplate this material, a real sense of sort of empowering relaxation, because I'm like, yep, I want to be intentional about my time, but I also want to cut myself some slack and stop trying to sort of fight my way to doing more and more and more and more and more, and realize that actually that fight to do more and more and more is never going to get me to the position of doing everything, because that's not how it works. And therefore, you know, I'm freer to really plunge into the book I'm writing today, to really plunge into the couple of hours that I'm spending with my son after school, to really plunge into the vacation or to the business venture, precisely because I'm not distracted by this thought of like, I'm going to totally nail life in some way. I don't know if that makes sense.
What should we focus on? You know, correct me if I'm wrong. Like, I think the whole point of recognizing the finitude of life is so that we can make the most out of it. Not from a productivity standpoint, but maybe from maybe a happiness or meaning standpoint. Is that accurate?
Yeah, I mean, I'm always, people quite often ask me, because I write these books, you know, so what are the things we should be focusing on in a meaningful life? And I kind of dodge the question. I try to do it honestly, but I am dodging the question because I think what I'm doing here, if it works, is I'm sort of dispelling a fog, right? I think we get into a situation where we honestly believe that later we're going to get a handle on life. We're going to figure things out. We're going to be properly optimized and all the rest of it. And then life is going to begin. And I think that is a sort of real life, you know, and I think that's a sort of a mistake. And so I sort of hope that what I'm doing is helping people see that it's a mistake, so that they can sort of live more intensely now, because they're not kind of postponing the real meaning of life to when they've got everything sorted out. But the question of what that actually means in terms of what activities you do in a life, I think that almost has to be up to the individual. And I think it sort of comes quite intuitively to almost all of us once you are slightly more in this kind of mindset of confronting and embracing finitude, right? I think most of us really know, right? There are certain kinds of work that just we really feel engrossed by. There are certain people we want to spend time with. For many people, they know that, you know, having kids is something that they want to do, or other people is something they know they don't want to do. But, you know, it's not hard to come up with things that make up a meaningful life. What's hard is in my opinion, is getting off this treadmill of like, I'm going to get to the point where I've got it all perfectly in control, that actually distracts you from fully showing up in life.
One thing I'm a little confused about, maybe you can clear up for me, is my understanding of part of your work, part of your book talks about, and I also want to talk about your new book that's coming out as well. Sure. If we have time. But part of your book talks about this notion that productivity culture is a trap, right? Mm-hmm. That ironically, if we're trying so hard to be productive and efficient, then that's going to cost us time, because we're like you just said, like we're trying to maximize productivity, and instead we should, you know, focus on what really matters. But when you say, you know, focus on what really matters, maybe this is just a semantic thing I'm stuck on, but isn't that kind of focusing on productivity? Like rather than me playing video games and staying up, you know, getting drunk, and being anxious about the future, I should perhaps exercise and spend time with family and do things that are enjoyable for me. Mm-hmm. Isn't that being productive in a way? Like I want to be productive. And so I guess my question is like, on one hand, productivity culture is a trap, but on the other hand, in focusing on what matters, in a way, we're being, productive. Again, maybe this is like a silly rhetorical or semantic argument that I'm making.
No, I don't think it's silly at all. I think there are some semantic issues in there. I think one way of thinking about this is, yeah, I mean, I think you're right. For example, that I do talk about productivity culture and productivity techniques being a trap, and productivity per se being a trap. But then I do talk about like meaningful productivity as a thing that we're sort of looking for here, right?
I didn't mean to make this a gotcha.
No. I'm interested in that. I'm interested in teasing this out. I think no, not at all. I think one way of expressing that is the difference between sort of valuing the sheer quantity of stuff you get through and that you get done over valuing how you're filling your finite hours on Earth. And so one of the ways that I mean, one of the things I mean when I talk about productivity being a trap is that if you take, and I write about this in 4,000 Weeks, right? If you take something that you have a lot of, well, email's a really obvious example, right? If you get a lot of email and you decide to get really efficient at getting through the email, and you kind of make that a big goal in your life, I sort of show why. What will happen is you end up getting more email. And so email ends up taking more of your life rather than less. And the basic sort of abstract level argument for this is just that if there's any kind of effectively infinite supply of something in your life, whether it's email or family obligations or places you want to travel or anything, getting more efficient at getting through more of them is not going to get you to the end of that supply, right? Because it's an infinite supply. All you're going to do is spread your attention more thinly and your time more thinly over more things. So in that sense, I think it's true that any sort of productivity techniques that are just focused on getting more done actually end up undermining the quest to spend your days in a meaningful way. Absolutely. Then, if you do want, as I sometimes do, to define meaningful productivity or productivity as like, a life in which the things you spend time on are meaningful instead of meaningless, then in that sense, productivity is absolutely the goal. It gets a little tricky because I think a lot of the time, or certainly for kind of driven people and high achieving people, one of the things that they maybe need more of in their lives is something that looks to the outside like wasting time, right? It's like resting, it's appreciating, it's going on a walk in nature, not just because you're trying to get fit or change your resting heart rate, but just because like it's fun to be in nature for that half-hour period. And so we can definitely get tangled in words, but I think we're talking about the same thing here, right? It's like getting really intentional and conscious about what it is you're doing with your finite time. And then, as I said before, not mistaking that for the idea that you've got to have a really sort of high pressure, wring every last drop of value out of your life, because ironically, that's not an enjoyable way to spend your life either.
Yeah. And not just being like I think what you're saying is don't be productive for the sake of productivity. If you're don't be productive at things that don't bring you meaning or value or happiness.
Right. There's no intrinsic benefit in doing something. It depends entirely what it is. Yeah.
Yeah. So like if you're very efficient at, right. So the problem with productivity is if you're just being productive to just, you're putting all your eggs in the basket of getting your biceps as big as they can be and doing everything you can to get that promotion. You might be really productive at getting towards that promotion at the expense of missing out on other things.
And I think sorry if I just chip in here. I think a real problem, a real interesting distinction here is that a lot of the time, maybe any approach to focus on productivity, but the kind that I'm sort of trying to push back against, it has this effect of defining the whole value of life as in where you're going, where you're headed. So it's like productivity is always productivity for something. And if that thing that it's for is in the future. That's great because we all want to build long-term things and do long-term projects. And I certainly couldn't write books unless I had some aspect of that in my life. But like the danger, and I'm speaking as someone who's been in this situation plenty in my life, right, is that your whole life just becomes like preparation for something later at the expense of the present.
Right. And I think that's a core theme for you too, is like being present, right? To the extent that we're just looking into the future, planning for the future, that's how you make life pass by quickly. Like I've noticed, you know, if you have a day or two or a week that feels like a long time, whenever I have a day where I feel like, wow, that all happened in one day, it was because I was doing, you know, a series of meaningful things and I was very present during it. And then if I have a week or two that feel like they flew by, it's because during that week, I'm thinking about the next week. I'm thinking about the next project. I'm thinking about the next thing. And I feel like time moves slower when we're present and it moves faster when our head is in the future. Is that right?
I think that's really, I think it's a really good observation. And I think, I think that, you know, it's difficult or tricky sometimes because talking about being present in the moment quite often leads into a place of sort of a certain kind of, you know, a certain kind of writing about mindfulness and such like, which is very much has a sort of a passive feel. And it's very much about just being and just sort of, it's actually, again, quite difficult to do, to sort of make yourself be in the moment. What does that even mean?
Yeah.
But when you realize that actually you don't have any choice, right? We are always only in the moment anyway. I think it can aid a perspective shift where you come to see, like, you know, I'm not going to live forever. And therefore, if there isn't something enjoyable or important or something meaningful about what I'm doing at the moment, then something's gone a bit wrong, right? If it's all about the future. And by the way, this is partly a sort of age-related thing. I think younger in adulthood, it's very natural to think of, you know, the real meaning of your life being in the future because you're at the beginning of a journey. When you start to get into your like mid and late 40s like me, obviously it gets harder and harder to maintain the notion that like the moment of truth is coming later, because eventually, like, when's this going to be? Or is it going to be when I'm 70? You know, so I think it's very very sort of, I think living in the moment is important, but sort of trying really hard to live in the moment may not be the way to get there.
How do you get there? How do you be in the moment?
You know, I think it's just really what I'm trying to do, and I'm trying to do this a little bit more, I guess, in my new book, which is called Meditations for Mortals, but it's definitely there in 4,000 Weeks, is just sort of constantly help people, and this is what I do for myself, help people make this little perspective shift, right? It isn't a question of a specific habit. It isn't a question of, like, always write this one prompt in your journal every day. It's really just a question of kind of getting into the practice of having it occur to you that, like, oh, this is it. I'm here. This is it, right? So if I'm sitting at dinner with my wife and my son, and I've gone off into my mind about the 10 emails I have to write that night before I go to bed, it's just the ability to slightly more frequently step back and say, no, this is this. And I think we really want a technique, right? And meditation can certainly help. Absolutely. Don't disdain meditation at all. But at the end of the day, there almost can't be a technique, right? Because if you were all focused on a technique, you would be saying, like, as long as I get good at this, then in the future I'll be able to be in the moment. And it's like, no, it's like, it's here. And so, it's a little bit of a frustrating answer in a way, but I think it is the right answer.
Yeah, realizing that this moment's what we have, and to lean into the experience that whatever you're having, whether it's this conversation or after this conversation, if you have a cup of coffee, to enjoy the cup of coffee, like to be present in whatever action that you're taking. Is that
right?
fair?
Yeah. And there's a lovely line from Alan Watts somewhere about how no amount of anxiety about the future has ever made any positive difference to the future. You know, it's like, it's that sort of trust to say, like, when the next thing arrives, I will deal with the next thing using my skills and my intelligence and my basic functional abilities as a human being. So I can let that belong to the future, which doesn't mean you never want to spend the present moment doing some planning, of course, but it does mean that like you can just sort of cut yourself some slack when you're drinking that cup of coffee, right? You can just enjoy the taste.
Yeah.
Because when the next thing happens and you have to figure out how to write the email that you're going to be writing later on, you'll do it then.
So I want to ask you about time. Time is a really bizarre thing. I mean, that's really what's encapsulating this whole. I think a lot of your points in the book is that we have limited time, and therefore, what do we? And that sort of informs a lot of the other lessons of the book. So time seems to be a paradox in many ways. And one example is, so I have a kid now, and I want my kid to get older, but I don't want my parents to get older, right? And I think most people think about time as not wanting time to pass by. I think if you ask most people, like, would you slow down time if you could? They'd probably say yes, because they'd think, I get to live longer, I get to experience more. Let's all slow down time. But if you ask a parent, how would you feel about your kid never growing up? Like, that is the worst possible thing that could happen to a parent. And so at the same time, we have this paradox of we want time to move slowly. We don't want people to die. But in the example of having a kid, there's no worse reality than your child not growing up and staying an infant forever. How do we balance the desire to want to preserve time, like simultaneously we want to make progress, we want to see things improve in our life, but we don't want to lose the time we have.
It's really interesting. Yeah, no, it's very interesting because you're so right about being a parent, but at the same time, like, there is a sort of nostalgia that's involved in parenting where our son is 7 now, and there are certain things I'd like to just sort of stretch out a little bit. It's like there were certain things about a couple of years ago that I miss. I absolutely, love seeing him grow and change, but there's a lot of nuance there, and I think you're right to point out these contradictions between your parents and your kid, but also even almost within parenting. I mean, I think ultimately, maybe it's avoiding your question in a way, but I think ultimately the funny thing about this is just like, it's almost funny to have these opinions about what we'd like time to do in the face of our absolute powerlessness about what time does do, which is just move on and move on and move on. And I think that part of maybe what you're touching into there is that there is this sense, and this is a thing that, like, Buddhist meditation teachers who know more about it than me have written on extensively. There is a sense in which the more focused you are on what is happening to you, the more abundant and full that time feels. And there is some mysterious sense in which, like, a single moment is all the time in the world, right? It's like, if you're really fully there, it doesn't feel like time is passing, even though obviously it is. So, I mean, two things. I think the best one can do in this situation is to seek to become more and more attentively immersed in the present experience, because then I think you get more out of time, even though you don't actually slow it down in any sort of literal sense. And then also, like, you come to see, I think, that there's something about the sort of sadness of time passing, right? So yes, even with a kid, it's like the sadness that toddlerhood is no longer the thing if your child is older than that. And the sadness with parents, older parents, of course, they become frail and then eventually they pass away. There's something in that sadness, and the Japanese culture is very good at this. There are lots of words in Japanese that get at this, which is sort of bittersweet. It's sort of poignant, is this really nice way of describing it, I think. So it's not happy, but it's kind of a wistful kind of sadness that seems to lend value to life. So I think it's possible to see that, like, even though the passage of time makes us sad in certain ways, the ones you mentioned with regard to your parents, that sadness is not necessarily an entirely bad thing that you want to try to eliminate from your life. It's a depth of feeling that suggests you're really paying attention to life in a way.
Yeah. Yeah. And the other thought I had with time is that, people say, again, to use the parent example, they're sad their parents are getting older. What's interesting is that, you are getting older at exactly the same rate as your parent or your kid, and at the exact same rate as the other 7 billion people in this planet.
Yeah.
And in that way, relative to other people, time isn't passing because none of us are getting older at a faster rate than any other person.
Yeah.
It's kind of interesting. We're all relative to each other. We're all to the millisecond going to be the exact same age difference until we die.
Absolutely. And I think, and it's not quite what you're getting at here, but I think it's where this conversation leads. We might as well just go there for a moment, is that as a psychological phenomenon, putting aside physics, because I don't understand the physics of time, but as a psychological phenomenon, time is just basically doesn't make any sense. And if you think about it too deeply, you're suddenly like, what are we even talking about here? And there's a famous line from, is it from St. Augustine? I may be getting that attribution wrong, but a famous thing about how I know exactly what time is until you ask me and I think about it, and then I've got no idea what time is. And other philosophers have noticed how whenever we try to think about time and use language about time, we almost, without being able to help ourselves, switch to talking about space metaphorically. So we instantly start seeing oh, well, my life is stretching out ahead of me, or have I got enough time today to cram in all the things I need to do? These are spatial metaphors. These aren't about time. There's something about time that is almost impossible to think about directly. It's really odd.
Yeah. It's bizarre.
It really is.
But it's there. We're getting older.
Yes.
So
right. Yes. It's the fact that it's impossible to think about, sadly, doesn't mean that you can just choose to disregard it.
How do we deal with uncertainty? So how do we balance the need to plan things for our future? We have to plan how we're going to pay for our kids' college, or whether we're going to get a new job, or whether we're going to move here or go to this event. How do we balance the need to stay present with the paradoxical need to plan for the future?
I've thought about this a lot because as I write in 4,000 Weeks, I sort of come from a family of compulsive planners, people who will, schedule their vacations down to the hour. And this is not a particularly healthy attitude to take to life. I'm not sure that this is a paradox. I think that it's important to ask why one is engaging in planning. And I think that a lot of us, anyone who's a bit anxious, a bit inclined to worry, certainly I am, is engaging in planning to try to achieve a particular emotional state, right? Which is calm confidence that the future is going to go okay. And the reason that worry has this compulsive quality and that you never can quite stop, and that it's like a dog chewing on a bone or whatever, is because of course you can't achieve emotional certainty about something in the future. That's just not an option. We can't have that kind of confidence. So as a result, I think what worry is your mind constantly trying to pin down the future and constantly failing because it's in the future. So trying again and trying again and trying again. Now that is, I think, very different from saying that sometimes, while seeking to be present in the moment and to use your present moment in a way that is meaningful, sometimes what you're going to fill those present moments with is opening the college savings account, or looking at your household budget to make sure you've got some money spare to put in the college savings account, or planning the flights that you're going to take on your vacation, right? That is just using the present moment in a specific way that makes it likelier that the future of you and those you love is going to be it's going to go in a good way. I think that's very different from being invested in this notion of like achieving confidence about the future. Because the fact, there's a wonderful or terrifying line from the spiritual teacher Robert Saltzman, who says we all suffer from total vulnerability to events. Like, within the laws of physics, literally anything could happen in the next second. It's not likely that, a grand piano will fall out of an upper story window when you walk out onto the street, but it isn't impossible. So you can never know what's coming next. Absolutely terrible things could happen to your absolute nearest and dearest, and that's always the case. But once you sort of stare at the fact that that's the case and feel the sort of openness and sort of vulnerability of that, it doesn't stop you making judicious plans for the future. In fact, I think it frees you up to make them with less anxiety and less sort of tortured feeling, because it's just like, yeah, there's only so much that you can do to guarantee that your child has a wonderfully rewarding and successful later life and education, but you can do the things that you can do, so just do them.
What if you're trying to make a decision about a future event and you can't seem to come to a conclusion? At what point are you using the present moment to plan, and at what point is it just anxiety?
Yeah, that's a really interesting question.
So where do you? Let me try to come. Where do you live now? You said you're in.
We live in Yorkshire, in England.
Basically, the question is, when it comes to uncertain potential big events in life, or you want to plan for this or that, and you can't quite come to a decision yet. Mm-hmm. Sorry to restate this. What amount of thinking through is rational planning, decision making, and where do we cross the line over to anxiety?
Yeah, I think, there isn't a clear criterion for this. It is an intuitive thing. I think it was, again, Alan Watts who said that a lot of what we call deciding is really just that you just sort of swing back and forth between two options for a while and then decide that you've done it for long enough and pick one. And we think of that as a sort of process of alighting on the right answer, when really it's just like, okay, we'll go that way. I think that a certain amount of that makes us feel like we've done our due diligence, and they're just, you can learn to recognize that moment when, okay, you've looked at job opportunities in this place, you've looked at cost of living in this place, you've looked at how many people you already know in that place, and you've been through it maybe you've been put through those issues twice already now. You're not going to get the sort of sign from heaven that says this or that is the right choice. Now, at that point, I mean, if you want to talk about this, I think one thing I've found really useful in my own life, and I write about in the book, is this question that comes from James Hollis, who's a Jungian psychotherapist, who suggests that we ask ourselves whether a given choice would enlarge us or diminish us. It doesn't work for everybody. It's not a magic bullet, but this is an interesting question to ask, because it kind of cuts around the temptation to ask, will this choice make me happy? Which is a very difficult thing. Where endless research shows we're very bad at predicting what will make us happy. Many things that are very meaningful in life are not totally full of happiness. Stumbling awake at 2 a.m. to change your baby's diaper is not an enjoyable aspect of parenting, but it kind of is meaningful to be a part of that process. And there are lots of examples like that of things that are not fun, but kind of are meaningful. So this question, does this choice enlarge me or diminish me, can be really helpful. And just to give an example from my own life, I moved from the UK to the US 15 years ago now. I've since moved back with my family to the UK. And very early on, after a couple of years, really, there was a moment when I was thinking, is it time to go back home to my country of origin now? And at that point, if I'd done that, I'm pretty convinced in hindsight that would have been the wrong decision in this sense, right? It would have been a diminishing decision. It would have been sort of running away from certain things that it was time for me to face up to and dive into. It would have been sort of retreating from the field of battle, as it were. But then 10 years after that, with my family, we made the collective decision to come back here. And in that case, staying in the US would have been the decision that was sort of shirking something. And I can go into detail. It's all very sort of specific and personal. But the point I'm trying to make is the exact same decision, right? This country or that country had different. It wasn't that one was right and one was wrong for all time. It was like one was right at one time, the other was right at another time. And the only clue I had to that was that I was aware in both cases that if I took the other decision, I would be like avoiding something that needed to not be avoided.
Whether that's a physical thing or a feeling, but you would have been running to something that's more comfortable, not because you should have been there, but because it felt more comfortable.
Exactly. Yeah.
And maybe what changed in your circumstance after spending a decade in the States was, it wasn't just that your mind changed or that you eventually gave in. It was that circumstances changed. I don't know what, but like whether your kids, your job, your family, someone got older, someone whatever, and the balance shifted where now before it was US makes more sense and now it became UK make more sense. So the reality changed.
Yeah. And only intuition, only that feeling of like, does this have the feeling of growth in it? Only that could adjudicate. Because if I was trying to say like, which country has the best X, which place is going to be better for Y, that would drive you crazy. And yes, as you say, would change and, it makes it just wouldn't work. So yeah, on some level, you have to be willing to be intuitive about it, which doesn't come naturally to me, but I'm still convinced it's right.
But not too intuitive. Well, but you did need to fight against some of your instincts, which were telling you to return to the UK because your family was there, your friends were there, and it said, okay, I've been here for a year. Let me head back. And that was part of your instincts, but you had to push that away because you knew that was just anxiety.
I mean,
that was just a nagging anxiety. That wasn't your full self.
Yeah. I don't know whether other people use this language in this way, but I tend to, in my own mind, distinguish between instincts and intuition. And I don't know if this might just be my personal language use, but to me, there's like instincts are very often like the thing that come most easily. And I can already see contexts where these words don't really work. So whatever, but there's one
I'm not going to pick you apart for semantics.
There's one thing inside you that just immediately goes to things, right? So it's like, yeah, if I think I might miss a plane or something, I immediately act as if this is the worst thing in the world, whether it is or not, because I've just got this conditioned thing.
Anxiety. We can call it anxiety, right?
Yes, exactly. We call that anxiety. If I sort of get quiet and think about which direction I want to go in life, it feels like that is a qualitatively different thing, which here, for the purpose of this conversation, I'm labeling intuition. Gotcha. And I don't think there's anything magical about it. I think it's just, I think it's just a question of the possibility that each of us has more intelligence than is necessarily evident in our sort of calculating brain.
What would you call the part of you or the feeling when you got to the US after a few months or a year, however long it was, that was nagging you to go back to the UK? What would you call that if that's not intuition? Was that anxiety?
Yeah, or just sort of like I mean, I think it probably was at least partly anxiety, but I'm trying to think of the sort of category of thing that it was instead of just that. I mean, it was the sort of, it was the sort of safe and it was the safe and secure thing to do. It was the sort of thing that would have predictability in it, the thing that would, at least in the short term, not involve as many intense spikes of, anxiety or uncertainty or not knowing what I was doing, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Less risk. actually, I don't think it is less risk in the long run, but you know what I mean? It's that sort of feeling of, and that's why I like this enlarge or diminish. It would have been it would have been the safe choice in a bad sense
Yeah.
of the word safe. Yeah.
And here's the other ironic or interesting thing to consider is it, and I hope you didn't do this, but if in the year or years that passed in the US, if you had spent your time thinking and worrying, like, oh gosh, should I be in the UK right now? If I was in the UK, I'd have these opportunities, I'd have these people. And if you were spending your time over the months or years contemplating and recontemplating and recontemplating the pros and cons of going to the UK, you would have missed out on being in the US. Like it would have,
Yeah.
you would have lost out on both.
Right. And yeah, you raised a very good point there. I think that like hanging around in indecision is also a decision about how to use your time. Yeah. And it can have a role. Like I don't think that I'm not someone who sort of advocates 5-minute decisions that affect the whole of the course of the rest of your life. It's fine to spend a bit of time feeling your way, but yeah, not to think that that is keeping your options open, because it is.
Well, like let's imagine. So you were in the US for, I think you said, like a decade. Let's imagine that if the entire decade you were thinking of whether you should go back to the UK, and then after the decade you went back to the UK, but the whole decade that you were in the US you were thinking about going back to the UK. So you never, you would never have really even lived in the US because mentally you're just occupied.
Yeah.
So that there's some extent to which like contemplating these things just gives us neither option because we're just stuck in.
Right. We think we're keeping our options open, but actually we're just choosing the option of being distracted by worrying.
Yeah. And then you get neither.
Yes, exactly.
What scares you about the finitude of life? What scares you about death?
I mean, I think it's just sort of unimaginably terrifying on some level. I'm sort of on the side of those philosophers and people through history who've sort of said that we almost can't conceive of it. I think we should separate off the question of dying. I think, there are painful and less painful ways to go through one's final months and years of life. And so I don't think I'd be at all happy to experience a more painful one of those. But put that aside for a second and just look at the fact of mortality and the fact that we're finite. I think that sheer idea that like, it's not even necessarily scary. It's just sort of incredible that, like the world is just going to carry on without me. I find there's something sort of absolutely unimaginably outrageous about this fact, even though it's literally the most basic and universal fact in the universe. I think that, it's almost too big for me to think about in my own case. I think it's much easier to just be terrified and sad about it in the case of people who I expect to outlive parents, being the most obvious case. If everything is going right in life, you will be bereaved when your parents die, or other close relatives of an older generation, whoever it might be. And that, I think it's sort of a bit easier to just feel the awfulness of it because it's not incomprehensible, but it is sort of really awful. I've got to say that what I end up writing about, and when I use the word finitude, I'm not really, obviously I'm only talking about something that exists in the first place because death is real, but I'm not really talking about that. I'm mainly talking about the consequence of that, which is, the fact that every day our time is limited and every week is a limited portion, and like all these things that wouldn't be true if we lived forever. I think it's very good that we don't live forever, but that's sort of a separate discussion. And that is just that is kind of scary in the sense that really letting go into that fact is scary, right? That really sort of stepping into today in the knowledge that it's transient, and because it's transient, is a different kind of scary. It's kind of it's like taking the dive off the diving board into the pool. It is a good thing when you do it, and it lends meaning and vividness to life. Whereas, being bereaved is not a good thing. It's there's a weird sense in which it's good that it happens, because it shows, it happens in the right order and everything. But it's so I think that finitude is actually just really uncomfortable. And a big part of what I'm pointing to in my books is just like, I'm not suggesting that I or anyone else can become totally reconciled to mortality, but I think you can get better at easing into that uncomfortable space of being finite. That means tough choices. That means it's worth being present in the moment. That means things just take the time they take, and that your control over the future is limited, and all the rest of it.
Yeah. By the way, this inability for us to fathom death and not existing is probably why religion exists, right? To give us that sense of, okay, there's going to be something afterwards. Do you think there's going to be something afterwards?
I don't see how anyone could ever say in a meaningful sense that they knew one way or the other. I got to say, I sort of have the normal assumptions of my broadly secular upbringing that no, there isn't an afterlife in any kind of the sort of sense people most readily think about that, right? Some place you go and you're still alive as an individual. I don't see any reason why that would be the case, and I can see why. Almost like it's such an obvious comfort in the face of these things that makes it suspicious in the first place. I do think, and this is definitely the influence of like Zen and Eastern philosophies on me, I guess, to some extent, although it's there in the mystical bits of Christianity and Judaism and elsewhere. I do think that there's something more in the sense that there's a way of experiencing life that is bigger than death in a way. And I think we all have moments of this experience. I'm not even sure. Well, I'm not sure what I mean. But I do think that if you read accounts of people who've had sort of what experiences that get labeled enlightenment in Buddhism, for example, and other kinds of spiritual transformations, and if you think back to any moments you may have had in your own life of sort of feeling strangely at one with the universe, which, might have been in a very mundane context, but a lot of people have one or two of those kinds of moments that they recall. And I'm sure that it's something that people who've done a lot of psychedelics have reference points for as well. There's something about that perspective that is bigger than death. That contains all the living and dying that goes on in the universe, rather than is completely snuffed out by it. But I'm not sure I know what I mean, and so I should probably not try to say anymore.
Maybe there is some way that our consciousness or soul or something is preserved after death. Who knows? Yeah. Your new book, Meditations for Mortals. I know we have limited time now, but tell me a bit about that book. We did talk about it a little bit, but this Meditations for Mortals reminds us that life's transience provides clarity and urgency, right? So a theme from your initial book.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And sorry, go on.
No, please.
Yeah, no, I was just going to say, I mean, I'm sort of going from our limited time to all the ways in which we're limited in this new book. So yeah, limited knowledge about the future, limited understanding of other people, limited understanding of how to be a good parent or a good spouse or do our jobs, and making the claim that it's by embracing those limitations and not sort of running away from them that we can actually live the most empowered and meaningful lives. The thing that really is important for me about the new book is the structure of it. Really, it's structured as 4 weeks of daily chapters, and you totally don't have to do this, of course, but it's like the sort of invitation is that you might read 1 chapter a day for a month, and that the sort of little perspective shifts that I'm offering there towards embracing finitude and really stepping into reality might take more root in your life because they're sort of because of that structure and that pace. I think there's a big tendency with books like this to sort of read the whole thing, take lots of notes, think to yourself like, okay, great, this is a good system I'm going to put into practice one day in the future when I get a spare week or something, and then forget about it, right? And you still ended up fueling that sort of future focus. So I really wanted to try to write a book that, if it could help this, would help people, do more of what they know they want to be doing in their lives right now in the course of reading the book, not maybe sometime in the future if you put my amazing productivity system into practice, but right here. There may be limits to how much any book could do that because it's still a book, but that was what I was trying to do.
So it's like taking kind of the lessons from the first book, 4,000 Weeks, and putting them into action, showing people how to put those into action, to be present and to be intentional, to embrace the impermanence of life and get rid of trivial concerns and focus on like getting to peace and compassion and wisdom.
Yeah.
Is that right?
Yeah. I mean, a big part of it is that, I sort of, as I've been going around talking about the new book, I've been at pains to point out that it's not like a sequel. You don't need to read the first one or anything like that. But yes, I still think you're right that it's really about that action step and that thing where you go from some rough idea about what you want to be doing and how you want to be showing up for life and like actually doing it. And in that, it's sort of born of my own recognition that I was a lot better at knowing what I wanted my life to look like than actually having it look that way.
Say that again. You're better at what?
It came from my own experience of sort of realizing that over the course of a long time writing about this stuff, you could really get a very solid intellectual grasp of how you thought your life should be, and still to sort of fail to do that in practice. So I wanted to sort of really zero in on that step from thinking about these things to embodying them.
It's the one thing to have like an intention or desire for something. It's another to actually live that way.
Yes. And it's in fact really easy to use one as a substitute for the other.
Yeah. In other words, by substitute, you mean?
Well, like it's very easy to spend your whole life sort of thinking about and reading about how you'd like your life to be, and to think that that's enough. And then, I can read all sorts of, I can read all the books and write all the journal entries on being a calm and present person. But if I put that all down and immediately snap at my son or my partner, then there's still work to do.
Yeah. Final quick question, not really a quick question, but so I've asked, how do we have, what should we focus on to have meaningful lives, or what is important? And I think you said it's up to the individual, right? Like you're not writing a book to suggest what we should do, but more about how we should engage with life and how we should embrace the present moment. Mm-hmm. Now, that being said, given that you've written these books and you've talked to people and you've given speeches, mm-hmm. what have you learned from all these conversations that you've had with people? Or from just conversations you've had, do you feel like there are aspects of life that are underappreciated that you think, people should lean into more? Maybe it's as simple as spending time with family.
I think, it varies from historical period to period and culture to culture and all the rest of it. But like, there are certain things that we don't emphasize these days that I think we could do with emphasizing more. And yeah, one of them is certainly sort of doing things communally. I think productivity culture especially drives us towards these very sort of solitary, I'm going to drive towards my goals, makes you very hostile to being interrupted. And I think there's lots to be said for actually being more available to other people and to finding more value in time with friends and family. I think that sort of what the psychotherapists call inner work, meditation, journaling, reading books that prompt you to reflect more on introspect more on your own experience is something important. I think it's such a cliche, but that's because it's true that, time in natural environments is kind of just extraordinarily powerful. And I think, doing things in real life, basically, to put a sort of general spin on it, is something that is only going to become more and more essential as time goes on.
Yeah. Well, Oliver, thank you so much. Let me end the recording here, then maybe we could spend a moment wrapping up, you and I.
Yeah.
All right. Yeah, thanks.
I know I've